Hello and welcome to lecture number 34. This is the last lecture in period 4. It is causation in period 4. We're going to go over a large overview of everything that happened and some of the things that were important and what the causes for them were. The first learning objective, the only learning objective, is explain the extent to which foreign politics, economics, and foreign policy promoted the development of American identity from 1800s to 1848. So this historical period very much emphasizes American identity and all of the things that led to this new national unified identity. And we're going to start with a new democratic society. So the United States began to develop a modern democracy, celebrated a new national culture, while Americans sought to define the nation's democratic ideals and change their society and institutions to match them. So one of the causes for this was the peaceful transition of power after the election of 1800, in which Thomas Jefferson defeats John Adams. And so it's a more secure form of government. We show the rest of the world that it can be done, that someone can, from a different party or from an opposing faction, can take over power peacefully from the one that's already in power. After the War of 1812, we see a new nationalist culture because we show the rest of the world that we can stand up to Great Britain again without losing our independence. And this nationalist culture celebrates America and its institutions. So moving on to the expansion of suffrage, the nation's transition to a more participatory democracy was achieved by expanding suffrage from a system based on property ownership to one based on voting by all adult white men, and it was accompanied by the growth of political parties. So this removal of property requirements by the states leads to what is called universal white male suffrage. That means that all white male adults are able to vote. This makes the size of the electorate, those who are eligible to vote, grow, and it leads to party organizations trying to develop and court the voters over to their side. So party politics becomes really important during this period. The party system between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans dies out shortly after the War of 1812 due to the Annapolis Convention. And for a while, we have a one party system really during the presidency of James Monroe. Then divisions within the Democratic Republican Party after the election of 1824 is going to lead to Andrew Jackson creating the Democratic Party. And because Jackson creates the Democratic Party and he is criticized by a faction of the old Democratic Republican Party of acting like a monarch, acting with too much power, we're going to have the rise of the Whig Party, of which Henry Clay is going to be the main figure. So while Americans embraced a new national culture, various groups developed distinct cultures of their own. So the regions with more cotton agriculture in the South led to a culture that was more permissive of slavery. This is slavery becoming a large part of Southern identity, even though 75% of Southerners did not practice it, did not own enslaved people. And though they didn't enslave people themselves, those who still supported slavery wanted to get to the point where they could have enough money or a plantation large enough into which they could have more enslaved people on their plantation. The regions with more industrialization in the north led to a culture in opposition of slavery, and they were advocating for free labor. Slavery competes against this free labor and it depresses wages. It makes wages go down, and so for that reason, the North opposed slavery, or one of the many reasons why the North opposed slavery. And then finally, regions in the frontier that are more undeveloped, that leads them to support a larger government that is going to put in place some internal improvements and transportation routes that are going to benefit that region. So this is how each different part of the United States before the Civil War has a distinct culture and distinct views on government. For religious and reform movements, we see an increasing number of Americans, many inspired by new religious and intellectual movements that worked primarily outside of government institutions to advance their ideals. So the Second Great Awakening leads to people joining voluntary organizations to support causes. The Second Great Awakening was a revival of Calvinist ideals, and some new religious sects and denominations are being created. that are stressing for people to choose religion, choose God, and become better people. And as a way to become better people, they start to go out and help others in these reform movements. We have idealist and transcendentalist ideas leading to people attempting to establish utopian societies. So, New Harmony, the Oneida community, the Shakers, all those are your examples of the utopian societies. The effects of new technology on regional identity. We have innovations in technology, agriculture, and commerce powerfully accelerating the American economy, precipitating profound changes to US society and to national and regional identities. So inventions like the steel plow and the mechanical reaper, these inventions that deal with agriculture are going to lead to greater efficiency in farming. You're going to be able to plant more crops. You're going to be able to harvest them faster, which will allow you to plant more land. And so then we see a rise in commercial farming. So the eastern areas are not going to have to plant their own food. They're going to be able to rely on commercial farms that are out west. We have the implementation of the factory system led by Samuel Slater in the north, and it leads to the United States emulating the British industrialization in the textile industry. So on the bottom here, you see a picture of the Lowell Mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. That was another factory system that used women as labor. They had to live in the factory complex and abide by the factory rules on how to behave. New transportation systems and technologies dramatically expanded manufacturing and agricultural production. So the canals and the steamboats, they make it possible to transport goods between the east and the west. So you see the picture here of the Erie Canal. You see on the bottom right, the Cumberland Road, which connected the East Coast to the Midwest. The new transportation routes are opening up new markets, which leads to increased production. So the commercial farms in the West are going to be able to produce more food that will be bought by the people in the East. The people in the East are going to be able to produce more goods in their factories that are going to be bought by people in the West. And the changes caused by the market revolution had significant effects on US societies, workers' lives, and gender and family relations. We see this with the cult of domesticity. So men are becoming more likely to be the breadwinners, working in the factories, winning a wage, and then bringing that back and being the sole breadwinner. And that's going to lead women to be more in the domestic role. They're going to be in charge of the home. The cult of domesticity was the idea that women had to be the moral anchors, the religious, the pious anchors inside of the home, while the men were going to be the ones that won the money and brought it back. Those women who are able to find factory work, there were few of them, but they did exist, they were out there, they become more economically and socially independent, like the Lowell girls, the Lowell factory that employed women. They were usually single, unmarried, and worked there for several years. If they found a partner and they became married, then they could no longer live and work on the factory. But it creates a new generation of women that has experienced that independence, and it will lead them to join reform movements and the women's rights movement later on in the mid 1800s. So the economic development shaped settlement and trade patterns, helping to unify the nation while also encouraging the growth of different regions. Like I said before, the different regions begin to specialize in an industry. The East is specializing, or the Northeast is specializing in textiles and other finished goods. The West is specializing in commercial farming. And of course, the South is specializing in cotton. And all of the regions are dependent on each other. The West is producing food for the rest of them. The cotton that's being grown in the South is going to the textile mills or the textile factories up north. And then the factories in the Northeast are producing finished goods that are being bought by both regions. The growth of transportation and communication lead to a faster settling of the West. So the railroads, the telegraphs, it allows people to stay connected and allows them to live further away from each other. For foreign policy, the U.S. interest in increasing foreign trade and expanding its national borders shaped the nation's foreign policy and spurred government and private initiatives. So we talked about the Louisiana Purchase, how Thomas Jefferson wanted to have access to the city of New Orleans and wanted to have the trade along the Mississippi be uninterrupted by foreign powers. And so therefore he made the offer to Napoleon to buy that land and that part of the river for $10 million. Napoleon came back to him and said, I'll give you all of it for 15 million. And so they took the deal right away. One part that we haven't really talked about just yet is the migration of American settlers into Texas, which at the time was still owned by Mexico. And so Stephen F. Austin recruits people. He gets a land grant from the Mexican government, recruits American families to go and live in Texas. We'll talk more about this in period 5 with Manifest Destiny and also the Mexican American War, which technically happens within this period's year range, but it fits better in the next historical period when we talk about Manifest Destiny as a whole. So, struggling to create an independent global presence, the United States sought to claim territory throughout the North American continent and promote foreign trade. So, we see this when the United States is worried about European presence in North America. James Monroe and John Quincy Adams issued the Monroe Doctrine. And it was supposed to be a joint venture between the United States and Great Britain because the United States at the time really didn't have the naval power to back up the threats that it was making, that any European power in the Western Hemisphere was going to have to go through the United States. There are issues with Spain and the British in Florida and the Seminoles. The attack that Andrew Jackson leads nearly starts a war with all those three powers, and it eventually makes the Spanish sell Florida to the United States for a reduced price of $5 million. All right, and then the expansion of slavery into the West and the United States acquisition of lands in the West gave rise to contests over the extension of slavery into new territories. So cotton growers, they continue to move westward as the land in the Southeast is exhausted of its nutrients and minerals. And as they move west, they're also taking enslaved people with them, which leads to this debate about whether or not slavery will be allowed in the Western territories or in the newly purchased Louisiana Territory. The addition of slave states would have upset the balance in the Senate, and it leads to the Missouri Compromise. So this is when Missouri is admitted into the Union as a slave state, and Maine is carved out in the Northeast and admitted as a free state. There is a line that is drawn, the 3630 line, which is the bottom boundary of the state of Missouri. It goes all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and per the compromise, no slavery shall be allowed north of that line and west of the Mississippi River. So it really limits the expansion of slavery to what is now Oklahoma and parts of New Mexico, because the rest of what the United States owned at the time of the Missouri Compromise was mostly northwards of that line. All right, and so finally a recap. A more democratic society arose from the expansion of suffrage. A unified nationalist culture arose from the War of 1812, while regional differences arose from the geographic and economic differences. New inventions and transportation methods led to a market revolution, and then that market revolution led to a new gender role for women and religious and reform movements and the interdependence of different regions. And then finally, the expansion of territory led to debates about the expansion of slavery. I hope this was helpful. I hope that you were able to see all of the causation and how one thing affects another in this period. If you have questions, always go back and see any time that you see on the slides the words led to or arose from or resulted in. That will help you see the relationship of how one thing leads to another and how one thing causes an effect. All right, so that was it for period 4. I can't wait to get started on period 5. I'll see you when we begin those lectures. Thank you for watching.